It's been nearly 10 years since I got my first graphics card. I remember it like it wasn't yesterday. I was in high school and I had just gotten the orange box. You know, back when you actually still had to buy Team Fortress 2, not like the free-to-play landscape it is now. Unfortunately, getting back home with the games and installing them made me realize that I knew nothing about computers. I thought my Core 2 Duo E4500 with its 2 cores and 2 GHz processing speed would be more than enough to run the games. Oh, naive Brits. I soon realized that the graphics media accelerator on that old Acer Aspire tower wasn't going to cut it for actually ever seeing those games run. You never really know the true meaning of a potato PC until you're rendering only a third of a frame per second and the sound effects of the game sound like a DJ's computer just crashed at a rave. Keep in mind, I'm only talking about trying to play at 1024x768, not these fancy 1080p and 4K resolutions we have today. So, facing the plight of not being able to play the latest games, I did what most of us would do in this situation. I begged my best friend who actually had a job and money to help me out and buy me a graphics card. While he was running the latest 8800 GTX Ultra with 768 megabytes of RAM at the time, he decided to have some pity on me and pick me up the 8600 GT. Thanks, Vishon. So I got home and I was able to finally play the games I had always wanted to enjoy. Although, I still actually haven't gotten around to playing Half-Life 2. So, why are you bringing this up, Brett? Well, my friends, I managed to find a score the other day. Sitting inside a computer ready to be thrown out was my very first GPU. That's right, in my hands I hold an MSI 8600 GT complete with 32 CUDA cores, 512 megabytes of 128-bit GDDR2 VRAM, a core clock of 540 MHz, and a memory clock speed of 800 MHz with support for DirectX 10 and OpenGL 2.0. Not only that, this freaking thing is completely passively cooled. Talk about hitting the jackpot. Which, with all this GPU goodness, it brings me to the point of today's video. MSI South Africa has hooked me up with the X299 gaming pro card and AC motherboard alongside the Intel i7-7800X CPU. This is a computer that I could have only salivated over thinking about back in my high school years, never mind actually think I'd be able to ever actually use one, especially one when the motherboard actually has my name on it. But here I am, and here we are, and here's my first graphics card. So you're about to witness the world's worst X299 high-end desktop computer build. The 6-core 7800X will be running at 4.6 GHz with 64 GB of G.Skill Trident Z RAM running at 3200 MHz, and the hot-off-the-presses 8600 GT. We're going to be benchmarking everything that came with the orange box. That's right, Half-Life 2, the original Portal, and my old stomping grounds Team Fortress 2. Then we'll hit up some new favorites like GTA 5 since it has DirectX 10 support, as well as Project Cars and PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, all at 1080p. Will this thing survive? How has the thermal paste held up after nearly 10 years? I'm fairly confident I'm going to have to put a fan on this thing. However, before you go smashing that dislike button because this is all low-end with a high-end board, I'm also going to be throwing in the brand new Lightning 1080 Ti on the test bench to see just how far I've come from my 8600 GT days until now where I have one of the fastest consumer GPUs in my office. So if you ever wanted to know how well a 1080 Ti can play Portal and how poorly a decade-old GPU can play PUBG, then you've come to the right place. So let's get started. As you would have probably guessed, the 8600 GT doesn't perform terribly well with the latest games. GTA 5 has an abysmal performance of averaging only 6.5 frames per second at the lowest settings at 1080p, while Project Cars does slightly better with just over an 11 FPS gameplay, again at the lowest settings 1080p. And PUBG, oh man, was just an absolute slideshow. Frequently rendering 0 FPS, the average came to just over 3.5 frames per second. Again, lowest, 1080p. disgustingly bad. The orange box fared a bit better. Half-Life 2 stays above 35 FPS even with the minimums, and averaged over 73 FPS at 1080p with high settings. Portal is a bit more intensive with a 16 minimum but a 32 average frame rate at the same settings, and Team Fortress 2 was in between either of the games with a 19 minimum and a 44.5 average. So the card performed about as well as you could expect. It's honestly awful at modern games but can run the older generation wonderfully. But another thing I expected about this card was that it definitely needs a fan. Apparently with these older series cards, there's no downclocking with high thermals. I knew there wasn't any boost clock, but the card consistently stayed above 100 degrees during the gaming sessions and even peaked at 110°C. The minimum temperatures even, with the card doing absolutely nothing, kept it running at 60 or so degrees Celsius. Which, you know what? I know exactly what this card needs to start performing properly. RGB. Let's replace the horribly aged thermal paste with some thermal grizzly and slap on an RGB Corsair fan to dissipate some of the heat, and then let's also overclock the card another 10% to see where we can get with this decade-old card. In case you needed any more proof that RGB increases your FPS, here it is. In GTA 5, we see a 68% increase in the average to over 11 FPS. Project Cars sees a 13% bump, but the flaw in my argument and the proof that I'm an idiot about RGB is that PUBG's frame rate went down 12% to 3.25 FPS instead of 3.5. But moving on, Half-Life 2 bumps up 22%, and both Portal and Team Fortress 2 see 18% gains. So the 8600 GT is a giant failure for the new, even if you slap RGB on it, put a fan on it, and overclock it. But it's a king at the old. But regardless of its numbers and its flailing around, it's very near and dear to my heart, and I'm going to be reserving a spot on my shelf for it to just lie and wait for another 10 years to do an update in the late 2020s. But now it's time to move on to the king of cards, the Lightning Z 1080 Ti. Now at the beginning of the video, I thought I would be testing them at the same settings to just see the difference in frame rate, but I realized there wouldn't be any fun in that. Obviously the 1080 Ti is going to crush any game at 1080p, and even at 4K, especially ones that are a decade old. I mean, we're comparing a card that's on GDDR5X at 11 GHz compared to a 500 MHz GDDR2, and a core clock of 1974 on a 14 nanometer process compared to 540 MHz on an 80 nanometer process. So instead, I decided to find out just how much I had to push the game's settings in order to get similar frame rates to the 8600 GT. The key here was to saturate the memory amounts on the GPU, as running any of the games, even at 4K, still led to decent frame rates. So first up for GTA 5, that meant bumping everything up to its highest settings in the general graphics section, including maxing out MSAA to 8 times with a 4K resolution. Then heading into advanced graphics sections, we turn everything on there, and also set the frame scaling mode to 5/4. So the game is rendering the scene at a much higher resolution than is being displayed, but it only used about 9.5 gigabytes of the total 11. However, the graphical intensity turned out to be enough with the game running at 12.5 FPS average, which is just barely above what the 8600 GT got with fans and the overclock. Project Cars took a bit more tweaking to get there. First up, I had to enable dynamic super resolution in the NVIDIA control panel to allow for a general resolution of 7680 by 4320, more commonly known as 8K. Then I had to max out every single setting that was in the settings menu, but when I did that, I kept getting an error message that wouldn't allow me to run the game since Project Cars requires that you restart the game with any graphical changes. So I modified the graphical setting file manually to revert the anti-aliasing, since apparently Project Cars doesn't like it when you fart around too much with that setting. So I slowly upped the anti-aliasing to find the sweet spot of poor frame rates, and it turns out that around the downsampling 6x anti-aliasing territory is where you can finally get the 1080 Ti to choke and run at an average of just only 9 frames per second. PUBG, unfortunately, as will be the case for the rest of the games, was impossible to get just as bad performance on the 1080 Ti as the 8600 GT. I again had a starting resolution of 8K, then pumped all the settings up to Ultra and jacked up screen scale the entire way, and it managed to pull nearly double the 8600 GT's 1080p frame rate with a final average of 6.2 FPS. Half-Life 2 at 8K with 8x MSAA and fully blown out settings ran at 155 FPS average, which is 75% better than the 10-year-old card. Portal was 118% better at the same 8K settings with an 82 FPS average, and Team Fortress 2 managed an 84% better frame rate with 97 frames per second. So there's just no slowing this 1080 Ti down with the older games. Even doing the worst I possibly could on my current setup, maxing everything out at 8K resolution with MSAI cranked up multiple times, I couldn't manage to slow this behemoth down enough to match the 8600 GT at 1080p lowest. Which does make a fair bit of sense since the 8600 GT was never the flagship. If only I had an 8K monitor and had run dynamic super resolution on that. That probably would have killed this. But with the new games, it's entirely possible to get this 1080 Ti to perform as poorly as the decade-old GT card. You just have to run everything at the highest setting at a consumer resolution that we'll have in like 5 to 10 years. Anyways, I'm going to wrap this video up there. Big thanks to MSI South Africa for supplying the Lightning Z, X299 Gaming Pro Carbon, and the i7-7800X, and thanks to Wootware for hooking me up with the 64GB of Trident Z RGB RAM. Be sure to hit that like button if you enjoy these odd experimental videos, and subscribe to stay up to date on everything I do around here. I'm Brett with the UF Disciple channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. This thing is massive, like, holy crap, it has 3 8-pins, that's insane, and then like the entire PCB is reinforced. This is just like a monster of a card, and then the RGB is really pretty because it kind of looks like the Trident Z. I really like it. Anyways, bye!